Mr. Chairman, addressing clauses 1 or 2, which of course the Labour opposition will support, let me recount a small homily which is in the nature of the previous member, Mr. Jones's contribution. Well, not perhaps with the same panache, but the content bears upon something that Mr. Jones has just recounted. It was a cold, wild and windy night in Wellington when I was a junior minister in the Beehive and my phone rang, and there on the other end I heard the dulcet tones of she who must be obeyed. Not God, but the next best thing, Prime Minister Helen Clark. "Can you come up to the 9th floor?" she said. No, it was worse than that. Because when I got in the door of the Prime Minister's office and I saw the Minister of Finance sitting ashen-faced at one end of the room, there was a bloke who I couldn't instantly recognise with a strong Australian drawl. And I thought he was undertaking a very high-risk exercise. He was wagging his finger at Helen Clark and Michael Cullen and telling them what to do. And I hadn't actually seen someone do that for a long time and live to tell the tale. And so I sort of said, more out of kindness than in anger, "Who the hell are you and what do you think you're doing?" He said, "I'm David Morgan, I'm the chairman of Westpac, and I object to this new regulation you're putting in around the Reserve Bank." He was the chairman of Westpac from Australia. He had come across the ditch to wag his finger at Auntie Helen and tell her that she was not to regulate the banking industry and not to tie these silly performance and asset regulations around the neck of Westpac Banking Corporation. Well, we did. And all banks were treated equally, and all banks complied. And New Zealand today is a safer and better economy because we have more assets domiciled in this country. And I'm actually quite proud that the last Labour government did put those regulations through, despite the wagging finger of that rather charming Aussie bloke from across the ditch. So today we come full circle. Today we are discussing the Westpac New Zealand Bill, which vests in Westpac New Zealand those parts of the Australian-owned institutional bank's asset book which benefit within the cap instituted under that policy. So there we are. And Mr. Chairman, for good reason. As we go to the title and commencement of the bill, we note that the words Westpac and New Zealand appear in the same sentence. That's got to tell you something. It's a New Zealand bank, and it's subject to New Zealand law, and it's subject to a full-service regulator, the New Zealand Reserve Bank. And lest we forget, lest we take it for granted, there were those, and I think more than a few on the other side, on the dark side, who suggested we didn't need our own Reserve Bank. We didn't need our own prudential regulations. We could just let Canberra do it. We could have our entire banking system regulated out of Canberra. How patriotic is that? Otherwise, it wouldn't be called the Westpac New Zealand Bill, would it? It would be called the Westpac Australia Bill, brackets, New Zealand bit, close brackets, 2010. But it's not. And it's not because the good old Labour government stood up for New Zealand. And they said, we want to own our own future. Own our own future. We want a banking system we can rely on. And we want a decent asset backing locked into this market, because when the rainy day comes, we don't want all that capital taking flight back to Sydney and leaving us all on our own poverty-stricken lonesome. And so here we are today, passing through what is universally regarded, thanks to the Maori Party's clarification, tautoko that it is unanimous in this House, and all parties, including the government, have seen the merit of putting the words New Zealand in the title alongside the word Westpac and Bill 2010. It's a statement of our sovereignty, sir. It's a statement of our sovereignty of New Zealanders. We are proud Kiwis. We want to own our future. We want to own a bigger, not a littler slice of our own financial system. And this may not be great news for Westpac, but we plan to empower Kiwi Bank to be an even more vigorous competitor by infusing its balance sheet with a little extra capital so it can go charging into the marketplace and do battle with our friends from across the ditch like we do on the footy field. What was that, sir? Well, now, the member, Mr Chairman, the member has provoked me. In the nick of time, the member has provoked me for one further short 5-minute drawl. What was the question again?
He was asking us why we set up Kiwi.
Oh, why did we set up Kiwi Bank? Oh, well, that's a long story. That might require... It would.
Clauses 1 and 2.
But I'm going to have to bring it back to the title on commencement. Well, the commencement of the bill... Mr Chairman, the commencement date of this bill, that's a very good question, because I assume that it's not the same date as is in the title. The title, of course, being 2010, and the commencement date comes into force when it achieves the royal assent, which couldn't possibly be 2010, sir, because we're in 2011, which brings me to a very important point. When making law, make it with a mandate. And if you are making law in 2010 and 2011, your mandate should come from the 2008 election, not the 2011 election. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound just a weeny bit familiar? Because there are other matters, sir, where the government is saying that they're going to seek a mandate from the public on November the 26th for matters that they intend to pass through the House in the next 3 days, just a mere Rip Van Winkle of 6 months in advance. Well, that, sir, defies logic. It defies gravity. And that's why it's important that this bill says the Westpac New Zealand Bill 2010, and the mandate was achieved in 2008. It happens to be bipartisan. But on this occasion, the government got it the right way round. Unlike KiwiSaver, unlike Working for Families, unlike cutting back on student loans, where they say they're going to go to the people in November to do something they're going to legislate for in May. That is not a mandate, Mr Chairman, that is a broken promise, but I'm glad the member opposite provoked that slight peroration into the chronology of legislation, provoked as it is by the title and commencement clause of the Westpac New Zealand Bill 2010. Let's sum up briefly. This bill is perhaps not the most, what should we say, complex bill that we've ever seen in the House. It's certainly not the longest. It may not be the most important we've ever passed, but it's very important to Westpac, and it does speak to some principles that actually do matter. It's called the Westpac New Zealand Bill for a reason. It's in New Zealand. It's in New Zealand because it's required to be in New Zealand by law. The assets and liabilities of the bank have got to be to a substantial extent under New Zealand law, subject to the regulation of the Full Service Reserve Bank of New Zealand. We are sovereign. In this House, we are sovereign, and that brings with it enormous responsibilities. Enormous responsibilities to our people and their kids, because we want them to grow up with sovereignty. We want them to own their own future. And that isn't just a phrase, it's a matter that is dear to all our hearts. And the day we lose control of our financial system is the day we will not own that future, and we've come perilously too close to that already. Mr Speaker, with those words of caution for the future, I commend the bill to the House.
Very good, very good. Mr Chairman.